I am David Jensen. I am the technical director for University Theater, and this is our How to Theater series. We decided to do something on 3D printing and 3D scanning, so we wanted to print a prop. So today we have with us Jayme Mellema.
Sure, I'm the scenic designer and person in charge of paint and props for University Theater.
And then we also have Ian Boyd.
Hello, I'm Ian Boyd. I'm a library specialist currently employed with North Carolina State University Libraries, where I work in our Learning Spaces and Services department, and particularly work in the makerspace here at NC State Libraries.
So I am very excited about this class. I've been wanting to print a prop for a long time. It's one of those things where we're just that much closer to saying, take it to the replicator and make 20 and make it smell like grapes too. We're that much closer. So some of the things, that we were talking about doing is we've got a big prop collection for our shows, and we've got a storage unit, and poking around in there looking for something good. I pulled out this guy, which Jayme made back in 2009?
No, 10.
10. So this was a scarab that was needed for Agatha Christie show, Murder on the Nile. And this is something that, he took and made out of blue foam and just kind of carved it and whittled it down. But it's one of those things where, he spent a lot of time just kind of carving this thing away. And I took a 3D sculpting class with Ian through the library not too long ago, and I thought this would be a fun thing to try to make 3D in a 3D sculpting class. And then we gave Ian a prop that has been used in many shows, usually just kind of sitting in the background, usually just kind of on a shelf somewhere. Most people never really realize it, but she's been in quite a number of shows just kind of in the background. It's just a good piece for set decoration. And if you can see, her neck has been broken. Because she's been used in so many shows that she fell one time and popped her neck off. And so we thought this would be a great thing to be able to scan in and try to replicate. And Ian, I think, has made it even bigger, which is one of the exciting things about being able to do things like this, is being able to change the scale and stuff like that. So that kind of brings me into a lot of things like, why would we want to print a prop? So we spend a lot of time prop shopping. So Jayme can tell you, he's been out there looking for things, searching eBay, going all over town, looking for props in antique shops and thrift stores, all kinds of different places. So what if we can just find something online and be able to just print it? And then what if we have something like this already in stock? What if we said, oh, we need 20 of these? Or like I said, or if we need to change the scale. What if we didn't own this, but what if another theater did? Could we just go over there, scan it, and then we've got the file, then we can print it. We don't have to borrow anything. Or say the Gregg Museum or any other museum, because I've gone to museums before and asked museums, hey, can we borrow that? And they were like, no, you cannot. But what if we were allowed to scan it? If we can scan it, then we can make our own. A lot of times the problem that we have is we get a lot of donated stuff, which is old, it's falling apart. And it's just not, we just can't use it. So maybe it's just an antique, or maybe we, again, it's not a museum, but we go to an antique store and it's too expensive for us to buy it. But if they'll allow us to scan it, then we can, make our own. And then other things is, again, like I said, searching for things. I'll look around on Thingiverse, but I doubt I'm going to find a scarab. But I may. You never know. There's a lot of things out there that people have made. Things that we've done. The angel wings for Secret Garden. That was from a file that someone had online, and we're just able to take the wings off the angel. Other things like the sculpture was broken, so we had a show Tea with Edie and Fitz, where we had to have a vase every night that would break. So we talked about Ian about how can we possibly make this break? How can we put into it break lines and things like that? Because we had to buy a vase for every single night. So, and the vases were always a little bit different because we can never find the multitudes of the same type that were affordable. So this would be a way to be able to print something that we could break every night. Also, other advantages of being able to print. So we made this for Titmus Theater. But what if we did something over in Stewart Theater? Would this read? So this read very well from a 200-seat house. But what if it was an 800-seat house and people were 50 feet away? What if the director said, just make that 20% bigger? I mean, Jayme spent a lot of time sculpting this. Now he's got to start over and make another one. But what if we could just change the scale and print it? And the other thing that's great about printing props is that they're super strong. You can make them really strong. I mean, it's plastic, depending on, again, Ian will talk about some of this, but some of the structure inside. You can go really dense, or you can go lightweight with it too. And you can repair plastic printed props with super glue. One of the big things I did see though is that you don't want to leave something 3D printed in a hot car in the summertime, depending on the plastics, because that could melt and warp or just start to fall apart. Or Ian, didn't you say that some of them would just they're sensitive to sunlight?
Yeah, some of them are photosensitive, so they will actually begin decomposing over time if they are left out in the sunlight.
Right, exactly. So, other advantages of why we want to do 3D printing. So, again, with something like this, Jayme's making this out of foam. If he's doing some files, he can be in the theater during tech rehearsal, making different things, working on, future shows and making the props that we know that are going to be difficult to find, and just kind of taking care of things rather than being in the shop, taking care of them on the laptop whenever he wants.
As an example, I literally did just find a scarab on Thingiverse.
Did you?
Yep. See, it looks perfect. So the time it took me to do research to actually figure out like what that scarab should look like is the same amount of time it would have taken to actually find a file that I could use to just print it.
That's pretty awesome. It looks good.
Yeah, that would work well.
And other things that we've talked about, printing is scale models. Furniture for scale models. We do lots of scale models and for directors and for the actors. Costume pieces, accessories, jewelry. And there are disadvantages too, as far as the time that it takes to work with these materials too. And Ian will get into that as far as sanding and smoothing and painting and stuff like that. But to be able to have the structure is pretty awesome. And there's so many different programs out there, SketchUp and Tinkercad and Fusion 360 and Inventor. And I'm gonna segue into the little Sculpt GL class real quick that Ian taught. So let me get into that. So this was a class that Ian taught, again, through the library. And they teach lots of classes. They have lots of fun 3D stuff and even a lot of sewing things and whatnot. But this was a, let me move. There we go. So this is a little sphere that you can do, and there's lots of different tools over here. There's brush and inflate and twist and smooth and flatten and crease and drag. So you can just kind of build up this piece of clay or take it down depending on what tools you use. Twist is no, how about a crease? So you can kind of start carving into things, and you can change your radius and whatnot to really kind of get a lot of stuff going on. But you can drop different things in here, cubes, spheres, torus, so lots of different things. But what I did, let me clear that, was after taking that class, I just one time just started playing around with the idea of doing that scarab. And I didn't spend that much time on this, but it's not too bad. It's a little squishy, could use a little this, a little that, but it was really kind of fun to just kind of play around with that. And it didn't take that long to do this. And again, you know, Jayme just found one on Tinkercad really fast, or if it was something specific, you know, you can go in here and do something like this. So yeah, so after that, we can export that file, and then we've got an STL. And then I think we'll pass it onto Ian to say what would be some of the next steps for that. And then he's going to talk about that sculpture and the being able to scan that and print that.
Dave, you mentioned offhandedly STL. Can you talk about like file types that work for this? I'm sure it'll probably come up later too, but.
I was going to see, I know a little bit about STL, but I think Ian is going to be able to kind of dissect a lot of that stuff a little bit better.
Yeah, absolutely. I can start
Great.
Jumping in a little bit by addressing a question, and it's a good segue to if anyone else has questions. Again, just feel free to let us know anytime in the chat. But real fast, an STL is the standard operating file type for 3D printing. It's a very simple file type that just contains point information. Not even, you know, the increments between the points are saved inside of it, but it works very well for being very readable across all kinds of 3D applications. And anything that's going to be generating a mesh for printing is going to need an STL. So it's kind of the default 3D printing file type. You may work with some other ones when you're kind of using your meshes virtually. .obj files are very popular and ubiquitous. You see them a lot across all applications, but STLs are going to be the king of 3D printing, that kind of file type. So yeah, I think I'd get us started here. So what I wanted to do, you know, as part of the makerspace was take you through kind of the process of taking this mesh or this prop right here and then turning it into this 3D print that I have right here. Let me pull one over. So we just got it right on the side. So yeah, there we go. Right off of it. Yeah, and it turned out pretty well, honestly. It was a good experience making it. And what I wanted to do was take you kind of through kind of the way that you would go through and take this from start to finish, starting with an actual object, in this case, this prop, and then going to a finished product, which is a primed and printed 3D print. So to do that and keep me on track, I kind of have a slideshow. This is only going to be part slideshow. It's also going to be part instructional. We'll get to points in here where I can stop and talk to you, and then we'll actually work through some of the process on our own. The first thing that you need to do to go from start to finish is you have 4 basic steps. You create or find a 3D file. In that case, finding one could be on Thingiverse. You could do it online, but you can also create your own through the application that I showed David, that GL sculpting program. Any other number of digital model creation programs, or you can make a 3D scan like we did in this case. Once you have that file, you may need to clean it. In this case, you're going to fix the mesh, make sure there's no holes in it, make sure that the mesh is thick enough to actually exist in physical space, and make sure it can be oriented in such a way on the print bed where it stands up and can stand up under its own power. You'll need to slice it at that point where you take it into your 3D printing application, and it's going to translate that geometry into physical paths for a nozzle to trace as it builds it up layer by layer. And then the last step is, once you have it sliced, you can go ahead and print it. And I should say there's actually 5 steps, because at that point, you'll probably want to finish it in some way, whether that's sanding it down to smooth the appearance or by painting it. So I'm going to jump ahead. So the first step for what we're doing here is we're using a 3D scanner. And what I have here is an assortment of scanners that we actually have in the libraries for students, faculty, and staff to use. So again, your structure scanner, one on the bottom attached to the iPad, but we have some more advanced scanners available as well. We have the Artec Leo, which is the one that looks like a handheld gun. That is very good for doing any kind of outdoor or large object scanning. To the side of it, the one that looks like a little box is the Next Engine 3D, which is a tabletop scanner, which means it's limited to smaller objects, but you can get a lot of detail out of it. So, and then in the middle is something that most people have, which is a smartphone. Your phone can also be used as a scanner. There are a lot of scanning apps available. Some are free, some are paid, but mostly they're all affordable, and they can transform your phone into a scanner. So if you don't feel like you have the budget for one of these higher end scanners, you can always try your phone, and for $5 or something like that, you can kind of experiment with 3D scanning and get started. Okay, so we'll go through. So when you're
sorry, just to add a little funny, yeah, we actually borrowed one of those plugged into the iPad, and there's a file of my head, Jayme's head, and who else? I think it was Alec maybe, and we always wanted to print off little busts of ourselves, but we haven't gotten around to it yet, but we've got the files somewhere. We'll do something with it someday.
I can only imagine.
I have scans of lots of my friends just like just on the hard drive for one day. One day I'll do something with them, but I keep collecting them. So I'm going to jump into an instructional in just a second where I actually break out the structure scanner and scan the prop that we went through, just to kind of show you the basic process for how you would scan an object and what to think about. Before I get into that, as long as I still have good audio on this machine, I just want to go through some of the things that I'll be outlining. The first thing is you'll want to pick the right object. Not all objects scan well, I guess I should say, and that leads me into my second point, where transparent or reflective surfaces are kind of hard for scanners to pick up in general. Most scanners are light-based. They're going to work by bouncing light off the object and returning it to the scanner. And if you have something that refracts or allows the light to pass through it, that messes up that process. There are ways to get around this. You can cover the object in some sort of powder, to make it more opaque. Baby powder works just fine, simple. I've also seen people who use gym chalk or climbing chalk, and just cover the surface, dust it, and you can capture a scan that way. But it's good to be aware of it when you start scanning. Another thing I say is stickers. You get them after a trip to the dentist, your kids get them at home, but stickers also in this way can give the scanner more information. So if I had this prop and it had a very large surface, let's say, I had a big blank white area, the scanner is going to have a hard time picking up on that because there's no detail. However, if I put a sticker, doesn't even matter what's on it, just as long as it has some kind of text, a sticker on that area, there is suddenly information for the machine to feed off of. So it may be worth your time to put stickers on top of any props. Whoops, sorry about that. Any props that you're scanning. It's kind of the same way where mocap actors, have the little dots all over their suit, motion capture. It's to give the computer something to pick up on, so you can do that as well. And finally, background noise. You notice behind me, I have this big noisy brick wall. Depending on what you're scanning, that can be a detriment. So sometimes you may want a very clean background. So things like laying out a sheet can be simple enough, and like putting the object on top of it. But if the object is actually very blank, it's like a big white surface, you may actually want a noisy background because it helps differentiate it from the object you're scanning. So just keep that in mind when you get started. All right, I'm going to go ahead, and if you give me 1 second to segue, I'm going to jump over to my other camera, and we're going to use the structure scanner to scan this prop that we've got here. So what I have right here is our prop on this stool, and there's a reason for that. Anytime you're scanning an object about this size, it's good to be able to walk around it because you're going to be doing a full 360 rotation as you go. So you want something that you can comfortably move around. A lazy Susan is also great if you have some kind of rotating table or object, because you don't have to move, because you can move the prop as you go. So that's also another option. I'm going to go ahead and grab our structure scanner right here and turn it on and open up my scanner app. So what I'm going to do is kind of show you the process of how I go around and scan it and what it looks like. Obviously, I can't show you the screen the entire time, but I think you'll get a feel for kind of how the angles work and how the process of scanning an object goes. So I'm going to lay it here, adjust my area. I'm going to hit scan. And what it's doing on my end is that every time I take a scan, I have to move slightly over, and the machine will ask me to stop. The structure scanner will ask me to stop while it pieces together that new angle, that new data, and then I rotate again. And I'm basically going to keep doing this until I have good coverage of the entire model. And right now you see I'm only going in one angle. As I go later, after I do a full rotation, I'm actually going to adjust. I'm going to drop down like this, and I'm going to do the same thing. But now, because I have that different angle of view, the computer can piece that information together, and it's giving me a more complete scan. And I don't want to take up too much time showing you this, but generally I'll take about 3 rotations of the object. I'll do kind of a top-down view, a side view, and kind of coming at it from underneath to kind of piece together all the information I need for a scan. Once I'm done with that, I'll just complete the scan, and I'll be able to email the file to myself, which I can bring up back on the other computer. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now.
It seems really simple. Somehow in my head, it was like so complicated.
Yeah, I love that. The one that plugs into the iPad, that's the one that we used, structure one.
Once I have a final project, I'm going to jump back over to my presentation real fast to kind of show you some images. If you're using a quick scan, like I did just there, this is kind of what you'll get. Like your first time scanning will probably look a little bit like this. So I'll just kind of show you. So it'll kind of look something like this probably. You're going to end up having kind of a rough mesh with some holes in it that you'll need to piece together and fix. And then kind of what I want to show you in the next part is how you would go about cleaning up a scan and getting better information and better detail, because there will be a few things you need to fix, but it's not overly complicated. Time to clean. But going through, there's a couple pieces of software you'll use, and I'm going to show you how to do that today. So the mesh preparation tools, Mesh Mixer, Mesh Lab, these are tools that are specifically intended to be used to prepare objects for 3D printing. You're fixing object like digital files, and then you're turning them into something that's 3D printable as an STL. So I'm going to show you how to do one of those today. Mesh Mixer, it's one I use a lot, and I'll show you kind of how to clean up these files. There's also digital sculpting tools that David showed earlier, Sculptress, SculptGL, are also great for cleaning up mesh information, because you can actually sculpt on the scan that you've made, and they're very good at handling high density files, which scans are. I'll show you in a second what that looks like. And I'm going to jump over to Mesh Mixer. All right, so Mesh Mixer by default will give you this view when you first open it, you'll want to import your scan data, which I have put in my desktop folder. One second. Yep. So this is the one that we just saw. I'm going to go ahead and bring it up. So you see right here that we've got some holes in it. There's definitely a hole on the bottom, which is something that you'll run into a lot. As long as you don't flip the model over or rotate it, you're going to have usually a hole in the bottom that you need to fix. And then if you got incomplete information on the scan, maybe you didn't cover it quite as much as you thought you did, there will be other areas in here that you'll need to fix as well. How you do this inside of Mesh Mixer is pretty simple. You can go to this analysis panel, and under here, there's just an inspector option. I don't want to get you too caught up in the details of everything, because I just kind of want to show you what will go into it. But usually in most kind of these applications, there's just a hole fill function, which you have up here, this flat fill. So I can go ahead and auto repair all, give it a sec. And what it's going to do is piece in geometry inside those holes to fill those holes. So if I look at it, you can see how many triangles are making up this scan, but it's gone in and it's tried to fill this in as best it can. Now at this point, it may not look how you want it, but you can take it into something like a sculpting application and then rebuild that geometry at this point. But I just wanted to show. Something else that you'll need to look out for when you're fixing meshes is you'll want to have a flat base. Something like the prop that David lent to me had like some casters built into the model, like on the bottom, which is good because it gives it something to sit on. But if you're printing it, all of a sudden you have a big gap between most of the model's bottom and then where the casters are. So in that case, you can also do some other things. I also like this plane cut tool, where basically you can go in, go all the way to the bottom of the mesh, and you can kind of find where you've got a flat base on here, and you can just discard everything to make a pretty flat base. It looks like here I could even have made it a little flatter. You have to, kind of gauge how much you're giving up with how easy it'll be. But let me just cut that a little bit more. You can see underneath where it'll generate it. Yeah, and we'll just do. So doing this, you can generate a really nice base for the model to print up from. Because if you keep in mind, this is your foundation, it needs to fit flat on a print bed. And anything that's in the air, above that base is going to be printing on air, or in this case, on supports. And I'll show you what that looks like in just a second. But I wanted to show you that basically to clean up your model, you're gonna have to go in, fill these holes, make the base flat, and then once you have a watertight mesh, you're ready to take it into a slicer. I also wanted to show you a comparison of the scan that we ended up getting, and an important point about 3D scanning. Let me go ahead and open this. Yeah, we'll discard that. So here's a comparison between the scan that I got very quickly using the structure scanner and the scan that we got for our 3D print by taking a bit longer. Longer both in the scanning process and in the post-production process. All right, so we're gonna move over. So here are the two scans. And the one we ended up using is this one on the left-hand side. And the one I just grabbed was the one that we did very quickly. So it's just good to know that if you put in some time into your scan, you devote that time to post-processing and getting a good capture, it will really pay off in the end. So make sure that you invest a little bit of upfront time, because once you have a model like this, you can reuse it as often as you need. You can print off many, many copies off this master file. And if your master file looks more like this, it'll still work. But if you invest the time up front, you can reuse it much longer and get good results out of it. All right, so I'm going to jump back over to my slideshow.
Ian, is Mesh Mixer free?
Yeah, it is. It's 100% free. That's part of the reason we like it. Anyone can download it. There's no restrictions. There's no student license or anything like that. You could put it on your machine this afternoon if you wanted to. Very small features is one thing I missed that I also like to talk about. If you have things that are too small in detail, they're not going to show up on the final print, because every printer has a resolution. Kind of like a paper printer. Like just a normal inkjet printer would have a resolution, like 300 DPI or something like that. Your printer will also have a resolution. The better the printer, the higher that resolution may be. But if a detail is too small, sometimes it will get lost. So just keep that in mind, that if you have very intricate small details, they may not translate. Although if we're talking about for the stage, chances are those details would not translate to the audience either. So just something to keep in mind. Invest the time up front. All right, so once you have a water type model, it's time to take it into a slicer. In this case, time to slice. So what a slicer does is that every 3D printer, before it takes an object and can print it, will need that object to be turned from a digital file, like an OBJ or something like that, into something that's readable, or OBJ or an STL, into something that's readable by the printer. And that's done inside a slicer. So what it's going to do is translate all that geometry that you've made into a nozzle path, basically one long continuous line that is going to build up your entire model. It doesn't have to be continuous. The printer can stop and go somewhere else, but that's kind of the idea, is it's going to build it up just in terms of one line at a time until it kind of finally reaches the end of your print. I've listed some examples of slicers that are pretty common. Cura and Slicer are both free. Most times, if you have a 3D printer, it's going to come with a slicer, but you can also find many open source ones as well. The one we use in our makerspace here at NC State is Cura. So I'll be opening that one up and showing you kind of what a slicer looks like, and then kind of how your model is built up and some of the things that you'll need to consider when you're 3D printing your model. So we're in here, Cura Lulzbot edition, because our printers are Lulzbot minis. When you open it up, it's going to show you an approximation of the print bed here in the middle of the screen, and then you can import your file to add it to that bed. So I'm just going to grab my desktop file. Yep, there it is. Okay. So right here, you'll see that we've imported the model. Can you still see my screen share? Everything's looking okay?
Yep, looks good.
All right, cool. It's looking a little large at the moment, but we'll go ahead and just scale it down. It will need to fit within the print bed if we're to print it, so keep that in mind. Everything that is going to be 3D printed has to exist in the real world. I mean, I guess that may sound, like obvious if I just say it, but like it's very easy to make something digitally that couldn't exist in, the real world. Something could be floating, it could be sitting on like legs that are like, like just 0.5 millimeter thick, a huge body supported by that. And if you put it, into the real world where gravity and weight exist, it's going to, snap and buckle. So it's something to keep in mind that your objects will have to exist.
Has to obey the law of physics, basically.
Yeah. Obey the laws of physics, listen to Isaac Newton and everything like that. So what I've got is this file. And to kind of give you an idea of how 3D printers work, it's actually very helpful to look inside the slicer. So I can go here and I can go from my solid view to my layer view. And what this is going to do is it's going to think about it for a second. And then it's going to make it into these antroscopic, layer paths. And what I can do here is I can kind of follow the entire printing process from start to finish. So what it's going to show me is this is just basically an approximation or a simulation of what the printing process is going to look like, as the layers get built up. And it also lets me kind of show the different parts of a 3D printed model, kind of do a cross section of them. So if you notice right here, I've kind of changed the colors on you. And the reason for that is to show like what the different parts are. So this outside area is when you're doing sorry, it's going to have to reslice because I moved it just a little bit. If you move it a little bit at all, it's going to have to recompute it. So it's just calculating all those file paths again. Okay, and I'll put it back up. Looks pretty much the same. This red area is actually a shell that is going to surround your entire 3D model. You have control over how thick that will be, but generally it's very thin, about 1 millimeter thick in most cases. And then the rest of it will kind of be filled with this grid, which we call our infill. By adjusting our infill percentage, you can make the part more durable and heavier. So a higher infill means a more solid piece. This grid is a lot denser. A lot of it's more plastic rather than empty space, but you'll use more material to do that. So it's kind of a trade-off of cost versus weight versus durability and all those things. So if I put it up from 20%, let's say, to something like 70%, it will have to recompute because, again, it has to compute all those pathways that it's making. But it will kind of give you an idea of like how much denser it can be. And this is something to keep in mind if you're making a prop as well. So you notice we've gone from 20 to 70%, and there's a big difference. You know, this is getting a lot closer to solid than it is air at this point. I'm going to step it back for a second. And then while it computes, we're going to talk also about support material, because support material is a big part of 3D printing, and getting it exact is something to think about. So what support material is remember when I said that printing has to obey the laws of physics earlier? Well, it also turns out that you cannot print in thin air. You can, but the plastic will just fall straight out of the nozzle to your print bed and become kind of a spaghetti mess as it kind of, builds up on itself. So in order to get around this, this inconvenient fact that you can't print in thin air, printers use a system of scaffolding called support material. So I'm going to go ahead and activate this and kind of show you what difference this makes. I also have a couple of shots of part covered in support material, at the part that we printed right here, and show you kind of what this looks like in terms of this one as well. It's going to look pretty similar to what you see here on the screen in a second. Yeah, so here it is. So when this goes to print, in order to hold up these objects, that are going to hang out here in thin air, right? Because if you imagine a printer would have to start the print right here on her chin, but there's nothing there, it's just going to go down to the bed. So in order to give it something to print off, it makes its own scaffolding out of the same material, and we call that the support material. So as you go along and print, that scaffolding builds up, and then it will have to be discarded afterwards. We'll talk about how you can remove scaffolding in the finishing section, where I talk about how to fix a print, but just note that this is a very real part of 3D printing, and that anytime you slice a print, you're going to have to probably generate this if it's not just a block that can support itself. All right.
And this is one of the reasons why I thought this would be a fun sculpture to try to recreate, not just because we've used it in so many shows, but just because it is so open and unsupported. So
yeah, it's very organic, which is always the funnest things to print, are things that are very organic and not very mechanical, because most mechanical things almost are just made to be 3D printed. They're just sharp edges, a solid base. It's a little boring, if I can use that word, but organic things are fun. They're fun to print. We like printing organic things, even if they give us a headache sometimes. So as soon as you were done with this, you would save it to the file, and then you'd be ready to print. So you would take it to your machine at that point. So this is a printer I have at home. Unfortunately, we're not printing the prop in this point. This was actually some face shield visors that we were making for our campus PPE initiative, but it kind of gives you a time-lapse photo of what it looks like when you're going off and printing. It is really just building it one line at a time, and it takes a long time. Something to keep in mind. So a couple 3D printers. I actually have one of them behind me right now. There's the Lulzbot Mini 2, just in the background of the makerspace. We have a lot of those in the makerspace. They're our most common printer by far. We also, they're FDM printers. FDM stands for fused deposition modeling, basically that you're fusing plastic filament and building it up and modeling an object with it. That term is also copyright. So you also may hear them referred to as FFF printers, which is, I believe, fixed filament fabrication. I may be wrong, I always forget that one, but basically it is the exact same term, just one is copyrighted by a corporation and one is not. One is open source. So FDM and FFF are the same thing. But they basically work by just putting a layer of plastic on top of another one. Like if you were, sculpting with a glue stick is a good way to think about it, but very precisely. We also have these printers at NC State. They're called SLA printers. And rather than use heated plastic, they use liquid resin that is cured by a laser. So you can have a little vat of liquid and you can just kind of draw your object up out of it, kind of like magic. It's very cool to see. You have a reservoir in the back, which is constantly feeding out the resin, and it cures it rather than heat. It uses light because the resin is photosensitive. There are also many other kinds of 3D printers. You can 3D print metal, through a process called sintering. You can 3D print organic compounds. It's kind of crazy how advanced the 3D printer landscape has become. But this is what we mainly stick through at NC State, is these two types of printers. talking about it, when you're going to print an object, you also have to use some kind of material, some kind of plastic compound. There's three that we primarily use in the makerspace, PLA, ABS, and PETG. PLA plastics are the ones we use most commonly. They are organic as far as plastics go. They're corn-based, and they are biodegradable. They'll actually degrade fairly quickly. When you heard David talking about it at the start of the workshop, we talked about how if you leave them in your car or in the sunlight, that can damage them. Usually that is PLA prints because they have a much lower print temperature, a melting point than most other plastics. These melt at about 205 degrees, when I say degrees, I mean Celsius, 200 Celsius to 205 Celsius, but they can start drooping at a lower temperature. They're also, like I said, photosensitive. They will degrade if left in the sun long enough. However, if you paint your prints and you seal them, you can get around this degrading process because the plastic will be locked underneath the paint and protected. ABS is a filament we used to use more, but don't as much. The big drawback with ABS versus PLA is it's toxic. Actually, the fumes are a known carcinogen, so you need some kind of venting system in order to get them out of your space. We have many fume hoods in the makerspace that we use. You can also use an enclosure, surround your printer in some kind of box that vents out the fumes. But just due to safety concerns that we choose not to risk it even though we have the vents. If someone needs it, we have an enclosure that they can use, but generally we print more with PLA. The advantage of ABS is that it's tougher, whereas PLA is very strong. It's also brittle, like it's more prone to snap. ABS is kind of flexible, not enough where you would notice, but if you start like moving it back and forth, you're gonna see a little bit of bend in it, where PLA is gonna be very, very hard and rigid. And the last one we have here is PETG, which is kind of a blend of both worlds, where it's stronger than PLA. It prints at a higher temperature than PLA, but it's also non-toxic, like ABS. So it's kind of one that we're exploring more, and we've been using more recently, but it's kind of a blend of both, of the best of both worlds. There's also lots of other filaments that you can use if you're 3D printing, way outside these compounds. You can print in flexible filaments. You can 3D print nylon. You can 3D print what's basically repurposed sawdust. It's like wood sawdust that's been held together with a glue-based binder, where the glue melts, but because you have sawdust, you're kind of 3D printing wood. It's a very strange kind of wood, but it is similar. So there's just a big range of filaments that you can use. So don't feel limited just by these three categories, although these are the ones that we see the most often. And you'll find these much more available, like on Amazon if you went and looked. Talking about cost real fast, 3D printing filament is cheap. Although the printer itself may or may not be cheap, filament is pretty cost effective. A 1 kilogram spool of filament will cost you about 20 bucks if you get it on Amazon. And this statue that I printed here was about 200 grams of material. So you do the math, 220, that's like $4, $4 for this statue. So you can kind of get cost-effective material pretty easily. Oh yeah, and here's the shot of our prop fresh off the printer, covered in its support material. So if you notice right here, all this would have to be removed before we got it to the stage it is right now. So I'll talk to you about how to do that in just a second, because we're right here into finishing techniques. So when you go to finish a part, the first thing you're going to find is that you're going to have a lot of marks, especially where the supports were. When you're going to finish a part, there's a couple of tools I'd recommend you'd have. Whoops, too far. Tools I'd recommend you have. And the first one is a pair of pliers, because actually how you're going to remove that support material is you're going to go in with the pliers and very gently, you're going to yank it off as hard as you can, very gently. And it won't damage the part because of how it's like printing, like against the grain, because like the support material is going the opposite direction of the plastic. So it's easy to just yank it off. But where you yank it, you're going to rip it off and leave like marks behind. So you're going to have to sand those off. And that's the first reason why I recommend sandpaper. You'll need a sand for a variety of reasons. Another one of which is that 3D printers will leave behind layer lines. You'll see very, very tiny increments, where the layers are built one on top of each other. So if you sand it, you can take those out. When you go to sand, I recommend a technique called wet sanding. And basically all this is that you take your part and you sand it under a running faucet. That's all. You're doing everything the same, but there's water running over it. And there's two reasons I recommend that. One is that plastic melts. You know, wood doesn't really melt, but plastic does. And when you start generating this friction, especially when you're sanding PLA, you're actually starting to melt the plastic with the heat of your sanding. And it's going to start dragging larger chunks out of it because the plastic's melting. If you are wet sanding, you're keeping the temperature under control the entire time. And you're also buffering off the powder quicker than you would if you were wood sanding or not wet sanding. So the reason behind that is you just get a smoother finish when these two factors come together. So I recommend wet sanding if you are sanding. You don't have to, but you will get a smoother finish once you look at it. I recommend starting with 120 grit sandpaper and then working up like you would with any sanding project. But usually 120 is a good place to start. Don't spend too long at 120 because, again, that outer layer is very thin. It's only about 1 millimeter. So if you're really sanding one spot hard, you may actually sand through that to the infill. And then that doesn't look good. You'll have to figure out some way to put putty over it or something. Some other tools that I recommend for finishing, pliers, a big one, take off support, rip it off. Flush cutters, anytime that you have support, sometimes it's, you know, it's stubborn and doesn't want to come off, and you can use those flush cutters to cut through it. I've got some right here, you know, just something with a cutting edge on it. A scraper or spatula. There's nothing more nerve-wracking than when you haven't 3D printed before and you need to take a 3D print off the print bed because it is stuck on there. So what you're going to use is something like this. This one's pretty small because the Little Spot Minis are small, but I have large ones too, you know, like paint scrapers and that kind of stuff. But you'll need to jam that under the bed without hurting your print bed and then pop it off. And a spatula is usually the best way to do that. You know, you need to break that seal, work it underneath. I had this object right here until you just break the tension and it just pops off. It's a pretty interesting feeling if you've never done it before. But I recommend having one of those to get it off. And some kind of blade. An X-Acto knife works. Usually X-Acto knife blades are a little too thin for my taste. They're pretty bendy. They can snap. You don't want a chunk of X-Acto knife to go in your eye. It's the worst. And when you go to plastic, it's even more likely to snap off than if you're working on soft wood. So usually what I use is some kind of thicker blade, something like a box cutter or something like that usually works a little better. Make sure that your blade is sharp, but also know that it's going to dull your blades completely. Like you're gonna ruin that blade when you go through and start cutting plastic with it. So just keep that in mind and make sure that you're not too attached to the blade you're using. And then finally, we want to talk about painting your parts. So the first thing that I always recommend is some kind of automotive or filler primer that you're going to put on top of it. This one's a Rust-Oleum automotive primer, and it has two advantages. One, because it's designed to fill gaps. You can put it on those layer lines, and it's actually going to start eliminating that appearance of them. So you don't have to spend as much time sanding. It's also going to fill in any scrapes where, you know, you ripped off the support material and maybe like pitted it a little bit. It's going to also help to fill that in better than a normal spray paint would. The other thing that I like about it is, I don't know if you can see that, but right here on the front, it says that it's wet sandable. So you can actually fill it in, put your primer on, and then you can sand off the primer and the part together, smooth it out, apply another coat of primer, and then just keep sanding it and working that and making it more smooth. As soon as you've gotten your part, you know, to a place that you're happy with it, you can then apply whatever other color or primer you want. But I recommend, especially if you're working with PLA, to kind of start with this automotive or filler primer. Those are the ones that I always go to for 3D prints. But then after that, acrylic paint works fine. You know, you can just put acrylic paint on top of the primer because you've already primed your object. It's going to stick to the primer, you know, a lot more than it would have stuck to the 3D plastic itself. The plastic, you know, PLA can take paint, but it's really good to have a primer to hold on to. And then also nail polish. If you're working with something small, that's something I always say, people like nail polish, but nail polish is also designed to smooth out and fill gaps. So it can work if you're doing a smaller object. You just have to take your cost ratio into effect because you're not going to want to print something big with a bunch of jars of nail polish. Okay, real fast, David touched on this a little bit, but I also wanted to say that scanning is not the only way to make a 3D print. There's tons of 3D modeling programs out there, just that you're welcome to go and try. I just put some ones that we use in the makerspace or ones that we're familiar with on here. So solid modelers, things that use math and things like that to generate models, Tinkercad, AutoCAD, Fusion 360, anything that's kind of got that CAD program, that CAD interface where you're laying down lines and building up. Surface modelers, I wouldn't recommend as much starting out because you can get into a lot of problems when you're working with like a thin mesh instead of a solid object. You can get into things like non-manifold geometry, which is a very scary term if you've ever worked in a makerspace, because people will constantly bring you in models that have problems in non-manifold geometry, and you can't even tell them what it is, you know, and it's a nightmare. But they are good if you're looking for something more artistic or you're already familiar with them. You also can use this to make 3D printable objects. So I just put Blender is one most people are familiar with. Sculptress, 3D sculpting programs like we showed, SculptGL is one of these. Sculpting programs have the advantage, though, that you are starting with a solid object and you don't have as much room to mess it up because you're, you know, cutting into it, carving it, bringing it out. So they actually work a little bit better for creating 3D prints than some of the other ones. And then finally, you can make objects in the same applications I showed you for fixing them. Mesh Mixer, you can make models in it as well. It has a little sculpt feature in there. You can use the tools that you use to clean up your model to create them as well. What I wanted to kind of talk about at this point is if there were any questions, you know, from anyone out there.
I've got a question.
Oh, go ahead.
So it's about, you know, we're always under the gun as far as time. Time is always a big issue with us. When can you find out how long a print is going to take? Does the slicer tell you approximation of time, or and when you vary the infill, you know, that I'm sure that's going to cut down on some of the time. Will the slicer tell you that, or?
Yes, that's where you'll find it out at that stage of the process. So whenever you put a print to be sliced in there, every slicer is going to give you an approximation, and you can vary the settings in order to make a print go faster or slower. You've already hit upon the biggest way you can do that, which is adjusting your infill. Putting a low percentage infill, like 10%, will make a print go much faster than if you made it solid. Solid prints can take a very long time because you have to build up a solid piece of plastic. And they get much heavier, you use a lot more material, and it takes much longer, sometimes up to 3 or 4 times as long. So what could become a one-day print may go into a work week print, you know, that lasts 5 days. So like it can make a big difference. And the bigger the object gets, the more that matters. You know, if it's a small object, it doesn't really make that much difference if it becomes solid, but because everything works cubically, you know, when we're thinking about area and volume, you know, suddenly the time spent balloons exponentially as you start getting larger. So it's definitely something to keep in mind. And you do find that out in the slicer. Sometimes what we do is people will bring in parts to be printed and we'll give them time estimates. Like we'll just throw it in the slicer and then they may go back and revise it, you know, to use less material or anything like that. So you can adjust it, you know. If you see that something is going to take too long, you can go back and fix it. Another way that you can adjust that print speed is most printers have speed settings and layer height settings. So you can actually increase how fast your printer nozzle moves throughout the print. The drawback of this is it's going to give you a little less fine detail because the nozzle has to go fast. Sometimes small details get removed. If you go to a bigger layer height, you know, everything gets a little bit more blocky. You get those lines a little, you know, are a little more apparent, but it can go faster because you could go from a, like, I don't know, like a 0.32 layer height to like a 0.5 millimeter layer height. And suddenly, like, all of a sudden your lines are a lot bigger, but your part prints a lot faster because it has to do a lot less layers. So both of those ways can cut down on your print time, although 3D printing is still slow. This prop I did right here, I'd say it took about 24 hours. It was about a 24-hour print, maybe 18. Somewhere in the 18 to 24-hour range. I put it on when I went to bed and it was still printing, you know, when I woke up. So somewhere in that range of fluctuation. And that's not uncommon for a large print. Some printers are faster than others, but the bigger you get, the more time it will take. And that happens quickly. Like I said, everything's exponential, you know, dealing with volume. So taking this print up another 4 inches may take a lot more time than, you know, taking it down 4 inches because things happen exponentially when you're dealing with 3D printers.
Right. And will the slicer also tell you the amounts of material that you're going to need to use too?
Yeah, it absolutely will. It'll give you a material estimate based on your infill. and then how much you're doing. Something we do here to save material is, everything feeds off of a spool, into the printer. I have a bunch of material spools behind me on the wall. But as you go, we usually weigh our material before we go, because you can tear a scale, and we just tear out the weight of the spool, and then we can just weigh and make sure that we've got enough to work with. And it makes it a lot easier to use those last few grams of filament, before you're because if you run out, you don't want to run out, because you'll have to start the print over right before it reaches the top. But you can, it will give you a material estimate, and it will tell you how much you need.
That's a good thing to know.
Yeah.
Do you need to babysit the machine the whole time? I know you said you went to sleep, but
generally no. It depends on a couple of things. It depends on the complexity of the print. If a print, has a lot of support, a lot of weird, not even details, but weird overhangs, stuff going out on its own, off the main body of the print, not well supported, those kind of prints are more likely to fail. So it's good to keep an eye on it, so you can cut the print, before it goes too long, because the printer will continue to print regardless of whether or not, the object has printed well below it. If you just Google 3D printing mishaps or mistakes, you're going to find all kinds of, images on the internet of just huge piles of spaghetti, underneath what was once a promising 3D print. But generally, you don't need to monitor them. Usually what I do is I watch the first couple of layers, make sure that the base is going on well and that everything is adhering to the print bed. And then I just, leave, and then maybe check on it, every hour or so if I'm around. If not, I don't worry about it. I'll just come back and see. So generally, no, a print does not need to be monitored, but depending on how complicated it is, it may be more likely to fail.
Right.
I mean, that's one of the common mistakes I've heard about is it being unstuck from the bed. Does that happen for a reason? Is there something that you can do to help prevent that, or?
Yeah, it does. So how it works is that when you have a large, we'll say large mass of hot plastic, what's going to happen is it's going to cool as the nozzle, as the nozzle passes over. So the hottest that plastic is ever going to be is exactly when it's extruded from the nozzle. And from that point on, it's cooling down to room temperature. What happens is when it cools is it contracts. And as it contracts, it may pull away from the bed because the whole area wants to shrink, but it's still adhering to the bottom of the print bed. So it's going to pull up off the bed because it's shrinking and cooling as it goes. This problem happens a lot more with plastics that need to print at a high temperature. So ABS plastic, which prints at 265, 270, that kind of range, has a much bigger issue because it's cooling that much more. PLA actually does a pretty good job of not contracting because it prints at a lower temperature, and there's a lower difference, in between its melting point and, room temperature. So you can find that you get a lot of issues with that as the plastic contracts and shrinks. There's a couple ways to prevent that. One is that you can increase the adhesion of your print bed by putting glue on it. And what I say by glue is I don't mean that the glue is actually holding it down. Basically you will take a glue stick and rub it across the surface of the print bed, but there's a chemical reaction that occurs between the plastic and the glue stick that actually enables it to be more securely stuck to the bed. The adhesive really isn't doing anything. It's the chemical compounds reacting with each other that is holding it to the print bed. So you can do that, and that's one option. You can also use a heated print bed, which all of our printers do, but not every printer has one. But that will decrease the difference in temperature between the melted plastic and room temperature. So, and it does it where it's most important to keep your plastic hot, which is where it attaches to the bed. So a heated print bed can also help offset that. Also, some people print their parts in enclosures. I talked about it for the fumes earlier on to get the fumes out. Sometimes the enclosures also will be heated and keeps the air temperature higher so that the parts don't shrink down as much as they cool. So all of these ways you can more securely attach a print to the bed, and people use a lot of them, especially if they're printing the higher temperature filament like ABS.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, I can talk about 3D printing all day. Another thing you can do, let me jump back into Cura. I can just show this real quickly as we go. So you'll notice by default, we have our print, but it's being printed directly on the bed. So that yellow represents everything that is like in contact with the bed. So that's all, directly on the print bed. If you want to increase that area, you can, and it's under this build plate adhesion option. So there's a couple of things that you can do. Right now, it's just showing a skirt. Basically, all a skirt is a one layer line around your entirety of your model, and it doesn't do anything for adhesion. It just makes sure that you can get any like irregularities with your nozzle, like extruding out of the way before it starts actually printing your object. It's just like, okay, let's push some plastic through. Let's make sure that everything's working, on a warm-up lap before we start actually printing the object. But these other options, the brim and the raft, can help attach your object to the bed more securely, and I'll show you what that looks like as soon as it's done slicing. And basically the idea behind it is that you're increasing the overall area that's in contact with the print bed, which should give you better adhesion because you have more surface in contact with it. All right, so here we go. So you'll notice what this has done is now there's about a 5 or 6 layer like width around the entire object. And all that's doing is trying to more securely hold it to the bed. So it kind of is a little like suction cup is maybe one way to think about it. That's like securing it to the printer. And then a raft is the same thing, but like on steroids is maybe a good way to say it. Instead of just doing like one layer, a raft maybe like has thickness, and it may be like very thick. It might be like 10 layers thick, and it's sitting on top of this big piece of plastic. And the reason behind that is because it's not in contact with the bed, there's more of like a buffer. Yeah, right here. So there's like more of a buffer zone, between the object and that. And you can notice, I personally hate rafts. I think they're awful. They're a pain to remove. Like they adhere incredibly well to the print because they just basically line up, with the top of it. I think honestly what this one has done, I don't know if, so like when that's directly on top of the raft and the grains going together, it's a nightmare to get the raft off. It really is. It's very difficult. You have to get a knife under there and kind of like cut through. And if you're not wearing gloves, you'll definitely stab your hand. So try to avoid rafts if you can, but they are sometimes needed if you really need to hold a print down. I guess they're like the nuclear option of these build plate adhesion methods. So these also are used in if you need to adhere to the print bed and you're getting that kind of warping that you talked about.
Ian, I think you said that you've got some more to present.
Yeah, I can talk through a few things. A couple things can be, I can actually kind of showcase our prop right that we've got right here and kind of talk about the process for cleaning it and kind of what it looked like on this specific model, because you can just kind of get an idea. So this is the same statue that we took from the scan. You'll notice that I did cut it off a little bit on the bottom right here. And the reason just for that was to get that flat surface that was off the casters. So that's like one of the modifications that I made to it. And the reasoning is so you can get that nice solid surface. And you notice that the base here hasn't been primed because, it's hard to get primer all around. And no one usually sees the base, but if you wanted to, you could prime the base as well. But you can see that this is where it sat flush on the bed. So in through here, she has support material that was kind of going all underneath her face and underneath her arms through here. So again, very delicately, just go in and yank it out as hard as you can. That's just the way that you remove supports. It does take a little bit of muscle, have to put into it. Sometimes it attaches very, very securely. If you're running into that, you can actually lower the support percentage. I should say that I only showed you a very small part of the slicer, but the slicer is very, very customizable. There's at least hundreds, there might be thousands of options that you can tweak inside your slicer if you want to go that route. It does a very good job of putting that, kind of in baby steps. Like it's like, here's your beginner settings, here's your intermediate settings, and here's everything that you can customize, about every part of your 3D print. So you can always tweak those as you go as well. But then after I took all that out, usually what I do is I sand down where the supports were, because that's like where I prioritize. I try to do a general sand of the whole object, but I really want to get wherever support's attached because usually there are nubs. I also use like a craft blade to go underneath and cut them off if I need to, and the flush cutters, because sometimes if they're, just small nubs, you can get them off like very carefully that way as well. Taking care not to cut yourself, because it is easy to suddenly have a knife going through plastic, getting stuck, and you're like, oh, let me just force it through, and then just your hand flies off because it all just comes out at once. It's kind of a random material working with plastic. I think I see why we don't have like plastic carvers. Plastic's not a good medium to work in. But after cleaning that up, I went through, spray painted it down with the auto primer, sanded it, spray painted it again, and then worked that up. I generally don't sand to like a perfect smoothness on the first pass. Like I usually stay at 120 grit, sand everything, put on another pass, sand everything with 120, and then go up from there, because you're still applying that primer. It's going to get covered anyway. So it's just something to think about when you're improving it. Generally, I think this print turned out pretty well. It looks pretty similar to the model, so I was happy with how it got. I'd like to say thank you also to Roberta Gunnels, who works in the scanning studio, who also helped with this project, doing some of the scanning portions. So thank you, Roberta, if you see this. But yeah, there's a great student staff that works with us in all these spaces, and they really help make it possible.
I also want to make sure that you talk about what you do offer in the library.
Yeah.
So just so people know.
Yeah, absolutely. So through our Learning Spaces and Services department, we are a big branch of the library that focuses on instruction in the library. So rather than just, cataloging books, keeping books, maintaining, collections, we are actively invested in kind of the transfer and teaching of knowledge, because libraries are all about information transfer and making information available. And, a way that we have taken that is make these skills available, like the information on how to use, these machines that may not be available to everyone, open them up to the campus community, and anyone on campus can come in and use them, like, well, there are maybe, the same machines in the engineering departments, you have to be an engineering major or something like that. We try to open it up so that all students can come and use the space in the library if they need to. So by doing that, we first hold a fully stocked makerspace. We have about 12 Woolsbot Mini printers in this space currently. We have a laser cutter in here. We have a lot of other machines, a lot of sewing machines in the makerspace, a lot of vinyl cutters, things like that. There's just a big list, and we're always adding new machines. Like if something seems interesting or cool, we'll try to get one and then just see if anyone wants to use it. In the sphere of sewing, things like digital embroidery machines, where the machine will embroider, your design that you input for it, the 3D printer of sewing, but you can go from there. So we have all these machines in the space, and anyone is welcome to use them, but also we maintain a full staff in the space that is here to assist students if they want to have help with their projects, if they're just curious about these technologies or about making in general, and they want to, attempt it or learn, they can just walk in here. They'll need to attend an orientation first, just for safety reasons, but after that, the space is open to them and they can come in here whenever, and our student staff will assist them. We also teach workshops through the department. You've mentioned them a couple times, David, and I'll mention them again here, is that, in an effort to make these, kind of skills and abilities available to everyone, we also hold workshops, of more advanced topics than maybe we would cover in a walk-in. We can get a group of people together learning. We can get people in the makerspace to make a project, take it home, and then just kind of get started, in this journey of whatever they want to do, whether it's 3D printing, sewing, or, kind of doing the digital sculpting workshop that you took. Just making these skills available and showing people how to use them. So that's what we're really about in the makerspace and learning spaces and services in general. I have colleagues that are on the other side of the building who do the same entire thing for digital media, working in things like Photoshop or, editing videos, or, like recording audio and things like that. Like all these, kind of fall under the umbrella of the department. So like I'm concentrating in the makerspace here, but there's a broad variety of topics that we, like assist with and are on staff here just to kind of for the students, faculty, and staff to be able to use it and learn these skills and take advantage of them.
It's pretty awesome.
Yeah. No, it's great. I'm happy to be a part of it. Yeah. ran through things a little faster than I thought I would. Like I thought, like showcasing everything, that things would take a little bit longer, but it's good to get to, talk to you and answer these questions because
Yeah.
Besides being unstuck from the bed, what are some other common problems that people usually have? Either from the get-go to completion, kind of anywhere in between.
Yeah. So bed adhesion is a big one, absolutely, that we go through, but we see lots of other ones too. And then these can range, like every printer, kind of develops its own personality over time, even ones that are like the same brand or model. Another big one is that the bed can become unlevel. And usually that happens like if someone tried to pick it up or move it, and like, dropped it. The minis that we have in our makerspace, our 3D printers are pretty good about this. They're pretty good, but a lot of times you may need to re-level the bed as you go, because what will happen is even if your bed's off slightly, any difference in that bed, level is going to compound itself as the print goes further up. So it may not even appear to be an issue, like on layer 1 or even like on layer 25. But as you get to layer, 430, all of a sudden, that 0.001 millimeter difference is compounded upon itself, like with every layer, there's another 0.001 difference, another one, and then suddenly, like you're printing in a diagonal. And what can happen here is the layers can shift and like kind of like look split, or the print can just like fail because it's having to drop plastic too far down on itself. Or something worse can happen where the nozzle scrapes the top of the plastic as it goes on because it's off. So over here it may be printing fine, but as it turns to the other side of the bed, all of a sudden you like as you go around, and that's a sound that no one in any makerspace wants to hear. That's the sound of your machine dying, and you need to go fix it. But that can happen too, is that the bed becomes unlevel. Just for any number of reasons, it's good to periodically do maintenance on your beds to make sure that they're maintained at level. And most printers can do them themselves. They'll go through an auto bed leveling procedure, but sometimes if it gets off too far, you'll have to go back in and step in and do a little bit of manual work. Other issues that you can run into, lots of times, depending on the filament, the wrong temperature, like if you're not printing within a correct temperature range for your filament, and filaments can vary widely. Most plastics are actually pretty susceptible to humidity. If you keep a plastic out for a long period of time, like actually some of the moisture is going to leave it and it's going to become more brittle. So if you have, so there's almost a shelf life for plastic. As strange as that sounds, it's not what we think of as having a short shelf life, but print filament, if you left it out here for a year or two, you're going to start noticing a difference. If you try to like bend the filament, where once it was more supple and you could kind of wiggle it back and forth, now it's just going to kind of snap on you. So if you're using poor plastic or something like that, that can be an issue you run into. I think we run into it more in the makerspace because we buy so much filament, and there's always like, one with just a little bit left that kind of sits in the bottom of the bin, for too long. But if you're at home, you may be running through all of that quicker because you're the only one using it. But we do get some bad filament sometimes. And then if you, like I said before, if you print at the wrong temperature for that filament, you may not extrude it well enough, and you can get nozzle fog, where basically the nozzle will become too cool to make the melting point of it, to hit the melting point of the plastic. It'll kind of solidify on the sides, and like with every layer, it'll solidify a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more, and then it will actually work its way up, like into the extruder itself, because you feed the filament down into an extruder, and then at the very bottom, it's very cool. No, sorry, very hot. Sorry, very hot at the bottom because that's where all the heating happens. But it's cooler up top. So what will happen is, as there's a little bit of solid filament up there, it will start forcing more liquid filament up further up the extruder, and where it will solidify more easily because the temperature is cooler up here. And so it can work itself all the way, like up it, and just jam your nozzle completely if you're not prepared for it. So making sure that you print at the correct temperature and that you're working in the right temperature range for your plastic is also very important. And the reason I brought up that plastic has a shelf life is that sometimes even among the same brand of plastic, the temperature range can be more effective at one versus the other. Like if the plastic's older, it may need to print at a slightly higher temperature, not much, 10 degrees, 5 degrees, that kind of range, than one that is more new. Like all filaments kind of have a personality.
Speaking of which, I'm not sure how long you've had all your printers. How much mileage can you get out of a printer? When do you give up on a printer? How many prints can you get out?
It depends on the printer. For one, like I can't speak to every brand of printer. Some are better than others. Some will last longer. What I will say is that generally you can expect at least a couple years. Like it's not like the kind of thing where like after a year, most printers will be breaking. We've had printers in the hunt maker space that we've used for 5 years and running, and these are high volume printers. Like they're running pretty constantly because like prints are always going through them, which, like a normal home user may not be running a printer 24/7. But we kind of run that high volume, and we've had some of these tabs last a long time. One of the benefits of 3D printers, it could also be a curse if you want to look at it this way, is that they're very customizable. The TASs are completely open source. All the directions for building your own TAS are online, which is very handy if you ever need to fix one, because you can just go to, like they're all laid out like in, alphabetized list, like how to build this part, like how to assemble the extruder, like all that. And so you can find those and you can like easily replace a part if you need to. Like it's very easy to replace the bed if you need to. And most 3D printer manufacturers will sell replacement parts because printers are kind of aimed at a hands-on crowd. Like if that makes sense, like who's your average person who's going to buy a 3D printer? It's usually someone who's, comfortable making things or wants to make things or get hands-on, like with the machines they're using. So because they've kind of appealed to hobbyists in that way, most 3D printer companies will sell like a big range of spare parts. So you can, rather than buy a whole new printer, you can buy a new printer bed and just take it off and install a new one. And most of them have pretty good like instructions, either through the company or through an online community who, use that printer and, share stories and tips on how to use the printer most effectively and what's easiest. So you can get a pretty good, I guess to answer, you can get a pretty good amount of mileage out of your 3D printer,
Right.
especially if you're not running it all the time, 7 days a week.
We're pretty much right at the end here. Ian, thank you. Thank you.
Oh,
That was
yeah.
Yes, thank you so much for doing this with us today.
Great information.
No, absolutely, yeah. And I love talking about it. I mean, I do workshops all the time, so it's it just becomes second nature after a point where you just talk about 3D printing, for a couple hours to a group of people.
Right.
And I'm happy to do it with the drama department as well. Thank you for inviting me to do this.
No problem.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you. Thank you. We really, really appreciate it. And that's something, like I said, still haven't done it yet, but we're going to print a prop. For a show.
Yeah, well, shows will be back eventually and we'll have things we'll need. I mean, there's this already amazing new statue that exists.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's yours, guys. I'll give it to you when I give you back the prop. You're welcome to have it.
All right. Awesome.
Thanks so much.
All right.
Thank you, guys.
Well, thank you again, and hope to see people again.